I can see one so far. And this one says, "Hello, namaskar. Anāhata nāda is the unstruck sound. I just wonder if the infinite space itself is the sound which is present in the anāhata of all beings. Thank you." I don't know who addressed this.
Yes, I think Dr. Sudipta saw for this, this definition of the unstruck sound, and wondering if it's the infinite space itself is the sound which is present in the anāhata of all beings. I would say that probably some texts, mostly non-Jain, but also maybe even Jain, may think of it and formulate it that way. But we'd have to look at particular texts, I think, as Corinna has done, and as I'm trying to do with Song of the Soul. We have to understand the definition according to the sources that we have. And unfortunately, in the Jain canon, so far, those sources have been few, but we're very lucky because Corinna has now collected so many manuscripts and will soon be enlightening us, Corinna.
Hopefully. This is a wonderful question, by the way. And just from the idea that is expressed within it, I would not say no. However, I have not found any evidence in my text, the text I have worked with so far, that would give a definition that would fit, especially this, this question. But they would not interfere. They would not call it a no. So, yeah, I guess it can be interpreted in this way, but I do not have really exact evidence for this in the text. But thank you for a very good question, and I'm definitely going to look out for this. I like it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one more from Anya is asking if you can remind us what year the Song of the Soul was published, Chris? And is it possible he's actually getting some of his stuff from Yogananda? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Anya. I haven't had time to even be able to make a confident answer to whether or not he's drawing from Yogananda and SRF, but wouldn't that be fascinating? So in terms of the date, 1987, yes, it's later than Yogananda. It's coming later. And of course, Kriya Yoga, as you well know, Anya being an expert on Yogananda, having written a book about him, you know that Kriya Yoga was widely available and practiced by householders in India at the time, before Acharya Sushil Kumar and after. So it's very well possible. And I find that a really interesting question because the goals would obviously be different. And that's what's so fascinating about Song of the Soul is that when I practiced Kriya Yoga, or at least the prequel to Kriya Yoga when I was at Polestar Gardens, my meditation always stopped with the practice of listening for this internal unstruck sound. Because I wasn't initiated, I wasn't able to go past that point. They wouldn't let me, obviously, and I respect them for protecting that privacy. But it was interesting because the lead up to that and the goals of that were, of course, quite different from what Acharya Sushil Kumar is doing. And so we would go out on the lawn every morning. We would do energization exercises looking over the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly beautiful. And then we would go into the temple after doing our energization exercises. We would sit down and we would play music, sacred sound music with the ukulele and so forth. So there's this audible sacred sound. And then there's this listening for Soham technique, which I know Anya is all aware of all of this. I'm just explaining this to show how it's different from Song of the Soul. We would do the Soham technique, which is basically affirming our identity with the absolute. Soham, I am that, and it was a really interesting practice to do that with the breath, and then immediately following, do this practice of listening for an internal unstruck sound that was supposed to give us, in the end, as far as I was told, some kind of unifying experience, let's just say, that is quite different, of course, from the dualistic tradition of Jainism. And so when we come into Song of the Soul, we find similar practices, but instead of music, there's mantra. There's the Namokar mantra being used from gross to subtle. And then it's supposed to give us some kind of experience of connection with our soul. And I did find that interesting that in Song of the Soul, the soteriological goal, although it wasn't explicitly the same as Yogananda's, it was sometimes described in ways that bordered on a non-dualism. And this is something I find really interesting in his work. You do find in the Yoga Shastra, for example, Hemachandra describing some kind of identity with the soul, which is interesting. It's not a unity, as far as I can tell, like as we would describe, of course, in a monistic tradition or like an Advaita Vedanta. But the thing that's really interesting is that Acharya Sushil Kumar is describing it in ways sometimes that sounds very Jain, in some ways, at other times when it feels sort of Vedantic. And that to me is fascinating because some of that influence that, of course, Vivekananda and Yogananda had of Advaita Vedanta kind of painting a picture over these philosophies or providing a lens for them to see these philosophies, I think was clearly there. So I don't have a direct answer, was it inspired from SRF and Yogananda? But it is something actually that I'm now going to look at because it could be, it sounds convincing because of some of the language he uses. Thanks, Anya.
Do you want to add something to that, Anya?
Oh, yeah, I was just typing into the chat, but I'll try to actually highlight maybe a couple of these things in my talk, because as you were speaking, Chris, I was like, oh, that's like exactly what Yogananda's doing. In fact, he has, like, his poetry book is called Songs of the Soul. And there's some interesting stuff too with the like the head sealing stuff and like, yeah, the sounds. So we'll see if maybe it connects later. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. Yeah, and that's what's great. The panel that's coming next will be about mantra and sacred sound specifically, and you're going to be talking about it, so it's perfect. Yeah.
So we'll continue with the topic in the next panel. So I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so I want to encourage, because there's many participants. So again, you can type any questions in the Q&A box. There is a box you can see below. Yeah. In the meantime, I do have a question. Well, I have many, but maybe let me just put there one. It's about, so I'm very curious about why some Jain authors are, in the two examples that you mentioned, they're clearly engaging with other traditions. And of course, it's different time periods, so it's a bit tricky. But why do you, it's a complex question. Why do you think some Jain authors are doing this and some are not? Because for example, I'm doing my dissertation in a text from 17th century, and I cannot find any Hatha Yoga influence. So I keep on looking, and I am very aware of Corinna's research, and I'm trying to see if there is something similar, but there is nothing like that. So I guess there might be many factors. One of them probably sectarian affiliation, of course, the influence of Tantra at the time. But what else do you think might be these elements that can make Jain authors to engage more or less with others?
Corinna, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, and it's a wonderful question. Actually, whatever I say to answer this question is a speculation, okay? This would not be based on any research that I've done, because nobody ever wrote about why he or she adapted to, took ideas from other texts or left out others. What I do see in some of the texts that I worked on is that there has been, or there must have been, some kind of a mutual engagement and exchange. Jains never lived really isolated from others. I mean, people shared common grounds in cities, in villages, maybe on the court of a king. So they engaged with each other. They were in constant exchange of their ideas. They were forming their ideas while they were talking in order to maybe form some kind of a unique idea. They adapted what they heard and made it fit to their own beliefs in a way. And I think that when special, I don't want to call it a fashion, but maybe we can call it some new fashions that were coming up and were discussed in the marketplaces, the new hot thing to do, you know. Of course, Jain members of the cities could not, shut themselves down. And especially from Chris, you quoted this one quote from the Yogapradīpa prohibiting or asking not to involve too much with those tantric practices too much. That is an evidence for, at least for, that they were aware that their people and also people from their tradition were obviously practicing it, because if they wouldn't, there wouldn't be a reason for telling them not to, right? And the same thing I found in another text talking about pranayama and saying, okay, we are practicing pranayama in this way, in this way, in this way, but we will not do the more forceful things. Do not do it, because it will be too violent, for example. It will disturb the peace of your mind. So basically all of these things tell me that there must have been a reason for them to highlight us in their texts. So people did engage with those ideas, and there was basically no way around adapting them. And I think this is basically what they do. Now, we need to keep in mind, you are working, Alba, on the text of one single person, right? Of one great philosopher, one person that had their own ideas, formulated them, and was a great thinker himself, so very unique. He did not need to take any ideas from others, because he created his own. And of course, he was a very learned person. I think he was aware that he could stick to all of the teachings, the pure teachings of Jainism. The Yogapradīpa, on the other hand, I would consider more as a compendium, right? As a collection that draws from different texts. I have not figured out from all of the texts it drew, but for example, it copied verses that also appeared in non-Jain sources, which has never been a problem for Jains to acknowledge a good teaching from somebody else. They have always been open to this, and also, they acknowledged it. What they, however, did is they kind of adapted. I gave an example in one of my previous presentations on a verse that was taken from a non-Jain work. It has been found in several works, also in non-Jain traditions and other yogic traditions, talking about meditation being like an uninterrupted flow of oil. And like the sound of a bell, what I wanted to demonstrate you with my wonderful singing bowl today. So this is a verse that comes up in several yogic texts and Upanishads, and it also appears in the Jain Yogapradīpa. However, it was amended. The verse ends with a sentence that says, in the original verses, in the non-Jain sources, it says, "He who knows this, he is a knower." And it plays a little bit with the double meaning of Vedavid, somebody who knows things, but also who is aware of the Veda. And I think Veda was something that Jains really didn't want to accept in their text. So they changed this passage to yoga. And they called it, "He who knows this is a yogavid," somebody who knows yoga. So basically, those were adaptations that they took. The Yogapradīpa has not, I have not yet found a manuscript with a special author And I don't think I'm going to find any, because I'm more and more getting to the conclusion that it was really put together from different sources, drawing from, of course, Jain sources as the Yoga Shastra or other important Jain yoga texts, but at the same time taking into account the texts that were in fashion, if I can say it in this way, during their time. Thank you. Wonderful question.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is very interesting. More later and next year too. So we have one more question from Diana, and he's saying, I have a question that might be challenging to articulate. I've noticed in contemporary yoga classes, mantra practice is approached as either Vedic style chanting, using 3 tones with silence following after a certain amount of repetition. I've also noticed a more Kirtan style practice, call and response, that is more focused on different gods and goddesses and the relationship with the deities. How do these differences relate to mantra practice in Jain Yoga? How does the feeling of worship emerge when there is no god form? Oh, wow. Okay.
Great
That's a
question.
lot.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, there's a
Difficult
lot, I
question.
guess
Yeah.
there's a lot that could be said there about this, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I have not practiced Jain call and response kirtan. I have been with Jains practicing various devotional bhajans and things like that. But when Jains are practicing some kind of devotion, generally speaking, and it depends on the context, whether you're in a ritual context or some other kind of context, it tends to be directed at the Tirthankaras, as at the Jinnas, of course, as model exemplars of someone who's purified their soul, right? And so that constitutes a form of, you could say, bhakti, and puja and various mixtures of worship that are meant to inspire you to be like the image that you are giving devotion to, not to merge with the image or to become the image, but to actually just see the image as a kind of role model for you to follow, whose conduct and yoga was so perfected that it has led them to embody those qualities in such a way, right? So that's very different from other forms of Brahmanical forms of devotion, of course, where the goal may well be some kind of merging with or seeing of the god or goddess themselves, and that non-dual goal, as I was talking about before, that one might have. And then the final thing I'll just say is that, and I don't know, maybe Alba is seeing this in some of her texts. I think that Yashovijaya teaches this on the cusp of modernity and the medieval period, and others have taught forms of meditation that begin on the material world, go into sound itself, and then our meditations on the form of the jinna, so that becomes a form of worship on the jinna himself, usually himself, although Malinat, of course, in the Shvetambara tradition is a woman, and then on the formless qualities, and then eventually having some kind of maybe experience of one's own soul, even momentarily. So that's my response to the question. I don't know if Corinna or Alba want to respond to that, but Alba is also working on a scholar of Jain yoga.
Yeah, well, the one Yashovijaya, the 17th century philosopher I'm working on, he talks more about this inner transformation that happens inside. It has to be an inner cultivation, something has to really change inside, regardless of the performance, of the outer performance. So that's the biggest point that I will develop more later in future. But I do wanted to add to your last question, Diana. You are asking, how does the feeling of worship emerge when there is no God form? So I think there has been a lot written about this actually. Like one of the books that comes to my mind is Framing the Jina by John Cord. But then there are other books. I can send a few more. And there is this idea that, first of all, there is a difference between theory, or what some texts are showing as prescriptive, what should be done, orthodox texts, and the reality of people who are praying. So on the ground, anthropologists in Jain studies have shown that communities, there are many different practices, and people sometimes do actually pray to the jinas and the tirthankaras and different Jain figures to ask for also worldly things. Even this is not what is prescribed by the monks. Actually, they keep on, also in contemporary times, sometimes they keep on reminding them, don't do that, because in the Jain universe, the tirthankaras and these enlightened figures are just an inspiration. So one of the key ideas in this question is that how does the feeling of worship emerge when there is no God form? So the key thing that I've seen in these scholars who have discussed this question is that the inspiration is to become like them. So even if not equal to them, which is kind of a very high goal, is to embody some of their qualities one's own. So these are some of the qualities that Parveen has talked about, or also Chris and Corinna, that these texts describe, starting with compassion, generosity, all these qualities, non-violence that the Jain tradition wants to promote. So the idea is that those are the high top models of embodiment of compassion, ahimsa, and all these virtues. So the idea is that it's an inspiration to embody it and cultivate it oneself. So that's what I've seen in scholars who have discussed this. But again, in day-to-day practice, it has also been seen in communities that this is not always the case, that there are lots of influences from also Hindu traditions and even other traditions, I would say, and people actually go and sometimes pray for mundane concerns, as a job, a child, or whatever. So this is always kind of, in the Jain tradition, we see a lot of this duality sometimes. Something to add to this? Sorry, I went a bit.
I just think, yeah, that was great, Alba. I think it's important that you're mentioning the kind of anthropological, cultural dimensions that if we go do ethnographic or field work or something with Jains right now, and it depends where we go, we will see instances of that kind of transactional devotion that you described. That's been documented. And we'll read one thing in a text and the practice may not be the same. And I think that's an important thing to point out, especially in Jain studies, that for coming to terms with the fact that there's a living tradition and there's a textual tradition, and they don't always necessarily match. And that goes for any religious tradition, of course, that things that are said or written down aren't always what people do and how they actually practice, including, as we saw, with the unstruck sound.
And then the fact also, as Corinna, you were saying before, that the fact that when you see, for example, when some contemporary monks and Jain leaders caution about not asking for mundane or worldly concerns, or caution about some of these desires that are not in the prescriptive Jain text, also tell us that if they are cautioning about it, it's because communities are doing so anyway, right? And scholars, anthropologists have written about it. But in any case, there is always this model of the jina to be cultivated within oneself. That's what we see again and again. And then we have another question here. We have still a few more minutes. So we have, can Corinna say more about the practices of sacred sound in some other Jain texts?
No. Thanks for a wonderful question. So far, no, because I have not found specific practices in the other texts that I've been looking at. They did not even mention the nāda, so either it was not a subject in these times, or it was not practiced anymore. So unfortunately, the only very explicit descriptions I found so far are in the Yogapradīpa, where it goes around, I mean, it's almost, how many verses? 15, 16, 17 verses dealing with the anāhata nāda. So very detailed version. No, I haven't seen it anywhere else.
Wow. Yeah, in my text, I haven't seen it. Nāda, I haven't found it. But my text is for more, no, sorry, more than 500 pages. It's very long and I keep on looking. But definitively, puja and mantra are mentioned as preliminary practices. So that's interesting, and I do find this related. But in my text, 17th century, what I find more is not that he has only, this is Yashovijaya's author, it's not only that he's drawing from other texts as well, and from Haribhadra especially, but I see more of an orthodox position. Like there is a lot of karma theory, there is a lot of purification, a lot of, it's very Jain on that sense. I see engagement with Patanjali, but that's another story. As we say, Patanjali is more metaphysics and meditation, but not the Hatha Yoga tradition with postures and all. But again, we'll see more later. We have a few more minutes. I don't know. You want to
Yeah,
add
I suppose that the question, Corinna, about sacred sound is also meant to be kind of broad. I guess I'm wondering, like Jnanatra you mentioned before, I think in your course, mentions the buzzing of bees, for example,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
we have these references to sounds and unstruck sounds and things like that popping up in other texts, but they're not as central as it seems as they are in the Yogapradīpa, which is very interesting to know why you're finding them in Yogapradīpa, and only maybe like these kind of scattered references in other texts.
Yeah. But what I find very interesting in Yogapradīpa is the Jain, how they make it Jain. And Corinna has given us some examples, because we know those meanings in the Hatha Yoga texts are different, and the Jain authors really tricky. They use sometimes the same images, the same metaphors, but they emphasize always, the karma and purification, cleansing of the soul, and getting that supreme self that you call it. Yeah. Which at the end is kind of one's own soul cleansed of karma. That's their idea. Because this is also tricky if somebody's not very familiar with the difference, right? Because the same paratman, the same term in Advaita Vedanta and other traditions is used differently. But the Jains use it in a very particular way, and it's one's own soul when it's purely clean from karma. It does nothing to do, just to clarify, it has nothing to do with this connection with a higher soul or whatever. It's a particular Jain understanding.
Yes, and I had this a lot when I had teachers look at this text. For example, in India, they very well-versed Sanskritist looked at the text and said, "Ah, there's so much Vedanta in it," and of course, vocabulary is very much similar as we just seen. Yeah, of course. But I imagine when people meet in the streets, they do not adapt their language too much, right? They've tried to find a common language that is used and understood by everybody, despite their religious heritage, for example. So of course, the Yogapradīpa is using the vocabulary that was available at that time. And they use Atman. They do not use Jiva, which was, but they describe Atman Jiva-like, you know. So it's the pure Jiva description. It's what needs to be purified. It needs to be cleaned from karma. Karma needs to be burned, and then it is described as the soul with the qualities as it is in Jainism. So yeah, call it Atman, but it's still a Jiva, you know. So
yes, totally same. I see the same. I see the word Atman very common because it's very well known. Is a word that everybody will know at that time. And then in the glossing, my text is a commentary. So in the commentary, then it will be gloss as this jiva. It will be clarified. But it's very important to point out the difference. When I saw these terms, Paramatman and all these terms, for example, my author is drawing from Yogindu. And Yogindu has a particular Jain understanding of those terms. It's not Advaita Vedanta.
yes.
That was very helpful, Corinna. Also, I learned it from you, so thank you. So we're almost on time. I think we can wrap it up, right? Thank you so much, Chris and Corinna. It's always such a pleasure to collaborate and to keep learning with you. And we're gonna continue with our next panel.